today, and we thank you for being here. If you're visiting with us, it would be helpful for you to know that we're going through the elder appointing process right now with this local group, and we've been doing that for the past 2 weeks. Jason did a sermon last Sunday about the work of an elder, and today I'm going to be doing a sermon about the qualifications that God gives to be an elder. So hopefully we can come at this with some open eyes to the text primarily, and an open eyes to our understanding of the text to understand what God would have us to do here. And I think if we have those humble hearts that just want to do what the Lord said here, we will be successful like we are in everything that we do when we have a humble heart that simply wants to do what God said. To get us in the right mindset, I'd like to just read this first paragraph of 1 Timothy 3 together, and then we'll break up the qualifications one by one. Let's just read the whole paragraph, starting in verse 1 of chapter 3. It says, "This is a faithful saying. If a man desires the position of a bishop, he desires a good work. A bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober-minded, of good behavior, hospitable, able to teach, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not covetous, one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. For if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God? Not a novice, lest being puffed up with pride, he fall into the same condemnation as the devil. Moreover, he must have a good testimony among those who are outside, lest he fall into reproach in the snare of the devil." And that's our context here for 1 Timothy 3. We could read Titus 1, but we'll bring up all the phrases in Titus 1 as we go forward. But it's also in Titus. As we begin, before we get into the one-by-one qualifications, let's make this point. And that point is just that the way our culture thinks about leadership. And this is one of these times when I think our United States culture, society, starts to dictate sometimes things that God said for his kingdom. And so let's just be clear about that. Our society celebrates reluctant leadership. That's something that we like. And we can trace that all back to Cincinnatus, who's a historical figure. The city Cincinnati is named after him. And he celebrated, he was the reluctant leader. I think more so that really capitalized it for our society was actually George Washington himself. George Washington was a reluctant leader. And we have these ideas in America about leadership. We think that it should only be men who don't desire to be a leader. They don't want to be a leader, but they feel like they have to. And that's the type of leaders that the U.S. celebrates. Men who don't want to be leaders, but they feel obliged to because no one else can do it. The Bible does not celebrate those people. And I think this is a clear counterculture sort of thing that we need to understand. The Bible has never celebrated reluctant leaders. You think about Moses, who would probably be the primary reluctant leader you think in your mind. Moses was reluctant to take on that leadership role. But did God celebrate that? No, God rebuked him for that, didn't he? And this was a moment where Moses needed to grow up. Now, God was long-suffering and he was patient with Moses, but his desire was for Moses to grow up and take that leadership role. And he really lets Moses have it in a few places about being a reluctant leader. So our culture really has a wrong mindset of what leadership is compared to the way the Bible talks about leadership. Now let's look at that first verse we just read. Paul said, "This is a faithful saying. If a man desires the position of a bishop, he desires a good work," doesn't he? That's what Paul said. That is not a reluctant leader, is it? That's a man who desires, he aspires to be in this leadership position. And what does God say? God encourages him to take it, right? Attain it. And that's how this elder qualification process in chapter 3 begins. This is not a reluctant leader. This is a man who has enough understanding and humility to desire the position of this leadership and say, you know what? I'm going to do what I need to do so I can attain that position. I desire it, and God encourages you to take it. Now, by the way, that works out in everything else we do. You know, when I decided I wanted to be a Christian, I went and talked to my dad about it. And what dad told me was, these are some changes that I think you need to make before you become one of Jesus' disciples. And what did I do? Well, since I aspired and I desired to be a Christian, I made changes in myself so I was ready to become one of Jesus' disciples. We encourage men and women to do that, right? When I wanted to become a spouse, when I wanted to be married, I think a lot of you other husbands would agree with me. You desired to be married to your spouse, and what did you do? You made changes about yourself so you could attain that position with her, right? You better have made some changes. That's part of it, isn't it? Now, how would becoming an elder any different? If a man aspires to be an elder, would we not encourage him to make changes so he's qualified? We do that with Christians. We do that with spouses. Why would we not do that with bishops? And I think that even if this process goes through and we don't appoint any elders, which is fine and acceptable to not appoint any men when you go through a process, if anything, what we can take away is say, hey, if there's men out here that see these things and they aspire for these things, well, oh boy, they should reach for those things. And they can be in the process of reaching those things and be appointed at a later time when they become qualified. And so I think that's a key thing that this sermon starts out with, this phrase here from Paul. One more thing before we hit the phrases. This is not just a checklist. One time a brother came up to me and he says, well, just because a man meets the checklist doesn't mean he's qualified. And I went, yeah. And I went, wait just a second. What do you mean he's not qualified? Let's be very specific about what we call this. This is not just a checklist. This is a checklist given by the Holy Spirit to appoint bishops, right? So if a man, and if we can say yes to all of these points, guess what that means? That means that man is qualified by God. That's what that means. If we can say yes to all of these points we're about to make. And that's a big deal. That's why Paul says in Acts 20 that the Holy Spirit has appointed you as overseers because they were qualified by the Holy Spirit's points. Someone likes to bring up with a point like this, they say, well, Andrew, what if there's something secret going on that we don't know about and they're able to sneak in? Well, Paul talks about that to Timothy later on in this book. And what basically Paul says is that we have to have enough trust in God that his system works. And number two, if there is something secret that needs to be revealed, God will ensure that it is revealed. And there's some trust in God that we're putting in this in our faith. So, the general speaking, if we can say yes to all of these points in a man, then he is qualified by God to serve in that position. And obviously, we pull a lot out of this first verse. Now let's go on to our first point. There's two qualifications in both of these texts that I think stand out to me. They're highlighted in my mind as some of the chief ones. And one of those two things is the first one that's in both verses, which is the word blameless. I think almost everything comes back to blameless. American Standard, you have the word without reproach. Before we get into it, you'll see the way I'm setting this up in my PowerPoint. Here in the red, I'm going to use the King James Version. And I use that because I think maybe most of this group is familiar with what the King James said for these words. And then I'll put the New King James and the American Standard, sometimes the ESV on this side, just so you have a well-rounded idea of the translations here. But the word here is blameless. American Standard says without reproach. This does not mean perfect. If we were waiting for a man to be perfect, to be qualified, we still wouldn't have any elders. We're just not going to be perfect here on this earth, are we? So that's not what he means. He doesn't mean perfect. He means blameless. Now, this means that a man has such a moral quality that he is a representative of Christ, right? That's what blameless means, is that we can look at this man and say, okay, he is a representative of Jesus. And that's a good thing to be. And that's something that all of us as Christians should aspire and be doing our best to be, is a representative of Christ, to be blameless. You see also later in the phrase, you'll see this line. He has a good report of them who are without. And New King James says, good testimony among those who are on the outside. Who's on the outside? It's not talking about the people in the parking lot. What is it talking about? It's talking about those who are not disciples. that even those that do not have Christ in their life, they also would consider this man to be blameless, right? He has a good testimony among them. And look at the warning, lest he fall into reproach and the snare of the devil. The thought is here is that if a man is not blameless, and there are clear things that people point their fingers and say, this man is to blame for these things, that Satan would take advantage of that. And Satan would use that as a crack in the dam to work his way into a local church and to cause problems. And so that's why it's so important that a man is blameless amongst the brethren and also amongst those that are without. Just one quick thing before we move on. Someone told me that this phrase has been misused before, and I felt like maybe I could just address it quickly, which is this thought that last phrase there, lest he fall into reproach in the snare of the devil, that they would use the phrase instead, they brought reproach against the church. And maybe you've heard that phrase before, approach against the church. Reproach just means an accusation of sin. Number one, that phrase is not in the Bible. Never. There is no biblical phrase that has anything to do with bringing reproach against a church. The person who brings reproach is on themselves. They accuse themselves of sin. You also have in 1 Timothy 5, you have Satan telling God he's accusing us of sin to God. There's really not a concept there of bringing reproach against a church. It seems like that's something that we kind of added on as the years went by. Number two, using this phrase, some people have tried to make accusations against a man saying that his family brought reproach, right? And maybe you've heard something like that. Does this passage here say family? No, it uses the pronoun he, right? This is talking about the man himself, not about what his family's up to, but about the man himself here. He brings reproach against the church. And when we have those conversations, and maybe we're bringing that up, this would be the phrase to go to, and I think the phrase explains itself. Number two, we have both times in Titus and Timothy, you see the phrase, the husband of one wife. Now, this is what I don't think it means. I don't think Paul's here saying now, don't you dare appoint a polygamist, some man that has multiple wives. For me, that just doesn't make any sense. Why would a church need to say that? Number two, polygamy is not even popular in their culture in the first century. Like, it is so ancient and out of date. They don't do that anymore. So it just doesn't make sense to me that he's saying, well, I don't want a man with two wives. I just want a man with one wife. I think what's being said here instead is Paul saying, we need a one-woman man. And this is talking about his character, that he has a wife and he is dedicated and loyal to that woman. And that's the type of man he is. It's talking about loyalty and moral purity. Now, again, some might have the position that that means that if the man has ever been scripturally divorced and remarried, or if he's been widowed and remarried, that he no longer has the right to be qualified to be in this position. But again, I just don't hold that position. And the reason why is because in any other context, we would never try to make the claim that that man had two wives. So for instance, if we had a man who was widowed, his wife died, and then he got remarried, would you ever walk up to that man and try to tell him that he has two wives? You know, with the clear teachings of Jesus, I just couldn't do that. I couldn't go up to that man and say, well, you have two wives. No, that man had one wife. And then his spouse died. And guess what? When his spouse died, he was unmarried. He had no wife. And then he got remarried, which was his right to do. And how many wives did he have when he got remarried? He had one wife. He only ever had one wife, right? And the way I just can't hold that position that a man who's been married multiple times in the eyes of the Lord as if he had more than one wife. He's the husband, present tense, of one wife. And that's what the position that I hold there. Now, to talk about someone who's been scripturally divorced, I think this needs to be part of the conversation instead, which is back to blameless. If a man has been scripturally divorced and put away his wife for fornication and got remarried, can his influence still be affected? I think that needs to be part of the conversation instead. And that, again, goes back to blameless. You know, is he blameless without reproach? Does he still have a good testimony among those who are on the outside too, right? There are men, and you know, some of us are in this room that feel this way, that we were able to put away our spouse for a scriptural reason, and maybe we got remarried, but we feel like we could have handled that better. And we think about maybe to the things that we said, the things that we did at that moment, and we think, well, you know what? I really should have handled that better, and other people know that I should have handled that better, even though they had the right to be remarried. And that's something we can repent of and we can grow and we can get better about. But again, I think that would be more of the conversation here than trying to count numbers. It's to say, well, does this man still blameless? Is he still without reproach? The way that he handled this situation, is he still blameless? I think that is the thing that needs to be a part of this conversation. Number 3. Titus 1:6 has this. We'll do Timothy's next. Titus says, having faithful children not accused of riot or unruly. I'm going to describe the word faithful, and then I'm going to describe the words riot and unruly. Faithful, you see in the different versions, often gets translated to children who are believers. Children are believers, right? Jason did a sermon 2 weeks ago about the word believer, talking about Enoch, and I think that's a good way to define this. That's that encompassing belief. These are faithful to God, having children who are faithful. That speaks very much to Ephesians 6:4. If he has had faithful children, then this man has proven he can raise others in the training and admonition of the Lord, right? And that's the promise there in the command in Ephesians 6. And I think we're being seen that again brought out in Titus 1:6. If he can raise his children to be faithful, well, then he can raise the other men and women of the group to be faithful as well. Now, again, this becomes one of these things where I looked at my sermon last time years ago when I preached this, and I realized I spent about 10 minutes on this, and I spent like 20 seconds on every other phrase. And I think, sadly, that's some of the ways that we handle this. My attitude now about it has changed. And the way I like to teach it now, or the way I would like to teach it today, is respect the simplicity of Paul's phrasing here. If Paul needed to give a long explanation about what he meant here, he would have given it to us, right? And he only uses a few words. He hits it and he moves on, right? And that's really the way I think that we should teach it, especially in a public way. I want to revere and respect the way that Paul handles it. So what I like to think of it now especially is just to make it a yes or no question. Make it a checklist like the rest of the phrases are. Is he blameless? Yes or no? Is the man a husband of one wife? Yes or no? Does the man have faithful children not accused of right or unruly? Yes or no? And for me, that helps me answer that question. It doesn't give me a room for maybe. I don't need some weird, crazy explanation. I don't need to be doing calculus. I don't have to do any of that. I can make it the checklist like Paul wrote it to be. Does the man have faithful children not accused of right or unruly? Yes or no? And that's the way you would answer the question. And that's the way that I would answer all of these questions. It's just to form it into a phrase or a question. Does this phrase apply to this man? Yes or no? And I think when we're considering a man or if we're considering ourselves, that's the way that we should handle it. Respect the phrase. Having faithful children not accused of right or unruly. Yes or no? Yes or no, right? And that's the way that I would handle that. Now let's look at Timothy's. Let's look at riot and unruly. This is what Titus says about those words. Maybe you have dissipation or insubordination. Dissipation is an abandoned, dissolute life, indulgence in sensual pleasure. Insubordination is just being disobedient and unruly. That these faithful children, they're not accused of those things. Nobody looks at these children and go, man, they're just dissipating, right? They just live this abandoned, dissolute life. That person obviously would not be qualified. 1 Timothy 3:4 says this, one that rules his own house well, having his children in submission and all reverence. And this isn't really so much talking about his children, just his children. In my mind, this is talking about his whole house. He's talking about the people that he's responsible for as the patriarch, as a father. And he gives a reason for why these people should be in submission and all reverence. And the reason is, if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God? Very logical statement. If a man's house is just full of problems and dissipation and unruliness, nothing goes the way it's supposed to, why would we put that man in a leadership position in God's church? That wouldn't make any sense at all. Now, instead, if you have a man who controls his house and has it moving in the direction it needs to be moving. He's able to handle crises. He's able to handle the things that the house needs to handle. Well, then that would be someone we would want to be in a leadership position in the local church, right? Because he would be able to use those experiences to take care of the church of God. And I like that one. It's very logical. It makes very much easy sense. Now moving on to the spiritual. And again, I hope that we would put just as much emphasis on the spiritual qualifications as we would on the family qualifications. Because frankly, our brotherhood has in the past put men in eldership positions that met family qualifications, but they didn't even come close to meeting spiritual qualifications. And they're just as equally as important as the other one is. So let's bring significance to these things that need and demand significance. Vigilance. Do y'all remember the last time I preached this? Nathan, don't shake your head so much. He's agreeing with me too much. I couldn't pronounce this word right, and I think I messed it up 4 or 5 times. Vigilance. This man, I'm sorry, Nathan. You got me. You got me. I can't think of it. This is the very thing I need, isn't it? Vigilance. The New King James has the word temperate. This man can be focused, can't he? That's the thought, is he's awake, he's aware, and he can focus on a task and he can fix that task. First, you have temperate in 3:2. Self-controlled in the New King James. He can be self-controlled and stay on task, right? The role of an elder requires someone who can stay awake mentally and spiritually, knows what's going on, knows how to handle something. They don't zone out easily, right? I think the greatest example of this is Peter's life. You remember Peter in the garden 3 times. Jesus has to come to Peter and say, stay awake, wake up, pray with me. Can't you stay awake with me for 1 hour? He does that 3 times. And then we get to 1 Peter, the epistle, and 3 times Peter warns us to be vigilant and awake and aware of our surroundings. You see the growth of Peter in that, where this is a person who's mentally and spiritually awake. They can stay focused on an issue and they can handle that issue. The second one I put is no striker in the King James. You gotta love no striker, that phrase in the King James. Not violent in the New King James. 1 Timothy 3:3, instead of Titus, says not a brawler, not quarrelsome, not contentious, right? Not soon angry in Titus 1:7, or not quick-tempered in the New King James. These should be very self-explanatory. But an elder is a man who has control not only over his attention, like vigilance, but he also has control over his emotions, right? Proverbs gives us a good line for this one. Proverbs 25:28. Solomon says, he who has no rule over his own spirit is like a city that is broken down and without walls. An anger issue would show you that that man does not have control over his own spirit, right? That he doesn't rule his emotions. No, his emotions rule him. And also comparing this to the children clause, the children phrase. If a man can't rule his own house, how could he rule the church of God? That is easy to understand. We make sense with that. How about this one? If a man cannot rule his own spirit, why should we let him rule the church of God? You see where I'm going with that. A man who can control his emotions could be helpful with the emotions of others. A man who can't control his emotions, he is not going to be helpful. He's like a city broken down without walls. Sober-minded in New King James. He has a clear mind. He's aware of his surroundings, right? 1 Timothy 3:2 and Titus 1:6. You also know this one, 1 Timothy 3:3, not given to wine, which I think is in the same context and maybe the same thought of sober-mindedness. Sober-mindedness is more than just alcohol. It's that they don't allow anything to affect their mind and the decisions that they have to make. Obviously, wine would be something that I think he's obviously talking about, which is the temptation to be drunk. And that, of course, would mess up the sober-mindedness qualification. I have never been in a position or seen a position where a man who we considered to be qualified was no longer qualified because he couldn't stay sober, and due to like alcohol or some type of drug. I've never been in that position. Maybe you have, but I doubt that you have, at least in the South or in our nation. So a man that I had a lot of respect for, that I have a lot of respect for, had this situation come up, and I was very impressed with the way that it was handled. And it was based off this qualification here about being sober-minded. You have a man here that serves in the position of a bishop, and that man all of a sudden becomes very sick, like we all do, right? And because he becomes so sick, the doctors that he has puts him on some extreme medication to get him out of that sickness. And as he's reading the labels on the medication that he's supposed to start taking, this medication won't even allow him to drive. They don't want him driving when he's going to be under the influence of this medication. So what did the man decide to do? Well, the man decided to step down as a bishop at that time because he's like, if I shouldn't be driving a car, why should I help drive a local church? And I had a lot of respect for that he was in a situation that was very innocent, a situation that he really didn't have a lot of control over. But he made the decision that being sober-minded, even in that context, was that important. That he could have a clear mind and he'd be aware of his surroundings, regardless of what he was going to have to do. In that situation, again, very innocently. But I had a lot of respect for that decision. I thought he was kind of, it made me want him to serve even more, that he was able to have that type of attitude about this qualification. Of good behavior. American Standard has orderly. A lover of good men in Titus 1:8. New King James says, a lover of what is good. The way I thought about this one is this is a man who, when you go and you talk to him, he loves goodness, and that's the things that he talks to you about. He talks to you about goodness because he loves good men, he loves good things, he loves goodness so much that shows on his outward self. He's a lover of what is good. If you go and speak to a man and he's all down in the dumps about what's going on in the world, he's obsessed with things going on in his business, he's all consumed with something going on in a sports event, and that's all you ever get from the man. On the other hand, what if you got to a man and he's all consumed with things that are good? And he tries to talk to you about things that are good. And when he's sitting on the couch and you maybe getting to spend some time with him, he talks to you about good men and good things he's seen that they do. That man doesn't have his head in the gutter, right? That man has his head in good things. And that's a man who's a lover of what is good. Another important one. All right, everybody take a breath. I needed that maybe more than you. The next one we've got is given to hospitality. 1 Timothy 3:8. New King James, you got the word hospitable. Titus 1:8 also brings it up. He says a lover of hospitality. New King James just says hospitable again. If you look up that word in Strong's, given to hospitality, it'll tell you the definition is hospitable. Well, if you get that word and you look it up in Strong's, what hospitable means, it means love to strangers. That's what the word means. And it's very much highlighted in Hebrews 13 when he says, do not forget to entertain strangers, right? For some have unknowingly entertained angels. The thought here, the biblical thought, is being generous to people you don't know. That's what the biblical thought is here. Somehow, in English, our world has painted the word hospitality to mean something that God didn't want it to mean. God had a different definition for that word. God's definition had to do with strangers. But in English, I really blame like the hotel companies. They changed the word hospitality to mean you coming over. And I mean, like, a hotel would be like, this is our hospitality. How is it hospitality? I paid for it, right? That's not hospitality at all. This is a business. So that's not the biblical use of the word, right? And I hate it, but I understand. Christians, we've been affected by that definition, and we also use the word hospitality, not in the biblical sense, but in the new wrong sense, right? A couple of months ago, Jared came over to watch Mandalorian with me at my house, right? He paid for Disney Plus. I'm still mooching off his account. What if I'm in that situation and I'm like, well, Jared, I'm just so glad I've been able to be hospitable to you today, right? And frankly, a lot of us, when we go over to each other's houses, we'll pray things like that. We'll say, Lord, thank you for their hospitality. We've all known each other for 30 years, but we're thanking God for their hospitality. I'm not going to correct someone. I appreciate the desire to be nice, But again, that's not the biblical use of the word. The biblical use of the word is not having you over to my house. I know you. This is taking care of your strangers. This is being generous to your enemies. That's what hospitality is in the Bible. You remember in Luke 6:33, Jesus says, what good is it for you, or how special are you that you do nice things for your friends? He's like, even tax collectors and sinners do nice things for their friends because you expect that they're going to do nice things for you. I let Jared come over, and Jared lets me mooch on his Disney Plus account. That's not special. Now, Jesus says what's really special is you do good for your enemies. Jesus is like, that'll get my attention. That's special, right? Jesus says you do good to strangers, people you don't even know. Jesus says, now that's special because you don't expect anything in return. That's true hospitality. And sadly, somehow, brothers and sisters have turned this qualification into meaning that person had me over into his house. But frankly, if you know that brother, no matter how many times he has you, who you know, into your house, that doesn't make him any more hospitable or less hospitable than he already is, because it's not hospitality. That's just having a friend over. That's just having a brother over. That's a nice thing to do, but it's not hospitality. Hospitality is love to strangers. I'm sure in 2 weeks or so, one of y'all will pray, thank you for the hospitality, and hopefully you hear my anger somewhere in the background saying maybe we could use the word kindness or generosity instead of the biblical word hospitality. I said at the beginning that there's 2 qualifications that shine out to me as 2 of the most important ones that encompass the other ones. The first one I said was blameless. This is the one that I think is number 2. This is one that highlights in my mind, apt to teach or able to teach. This man can effectively teach privately and publicly. I think the one reason why this highlights in my mind is because, especially thinking of Jason's sermon last week, we've said this 3 times now, a shepherd's job is mostly teaching. A shepherd who cannot teach cannot do the job of a shepherd. Going back to Ephesians 4, it says that Jesus gave some of himself to equip the saints. And those positions are apostles, evangelists, right? Then he says pastors, elders, then teachers. That Jesus gave some of himself to pastors, shepherds, elders for the equipping of the saints, right? For the teaching of the gospel. A man has to be able to teach so he can do this job. Now, this does not mean that he's some powerful orator, all right? It doesn't mean that necessarily you enjoy when he teaches Bible class. That's not what this means. What this means is he's able to do it, right? Which means that when he gets up here or when he gets down there, whatever it may be, he can explain a passage and you understand that passage which he just explained. That's what able to teach means. You can understand him, right? Now, there are good men that meet all of these qualifications out there except for this one. They just simply can't communicate a thought. And what I would say to those men is, look, this isn't some hidden talent that only a few of us have. This is something that you can work on. This is something you can improve on. This is something you can get better at. Being able to explain a thought, explain a passage. And several men have asked to study with me and Jason to become better teachers. I think that's great. I love that. I love that people aspire to do that. Like all of these things, this too is something we can work on and we can get better at. The reason why I say they can teach privately and publicly is because of other qualifications. In Titus 1:9, he says, exhort and convince the gainsayers. New King James says, holding fast to the faithful word he has been taught, that he may be able by sound doctrine both to exhort and convict those who contradict, right? Part of the role of a shepherd is he is able to communicate his thoughts in such a way that he also can correct things. He can exhort things, he can encourage things, but he also can correct things. Sometimes those corrections as shepherds have to be done privately. And that's when the shepherd goes and they talk to you individually, they maybe talk to you with just a few other people, and they can privately correct the situation. But also, there are situations in the local church where correction has to be done publicly. If I got up here and I said something wrong that's not in the text, there needs to be a shepherd who can come up here right after me and say, no, the text says this is what that means. That has to be done, right? I think especially in a situation where a place like this where we do have shepherds and bishops, I will never ever get up and try to correct someone publicly here. And the reason why is because it's not my job. There's men here that is their God-given role to handle that. So if something is ever said up here, I'm not going to jump up, run up here and think, oh, Andrew, I'm going to go solve the problem. No, that's going to be something I'm going to look at Ricky or Alan or Mr. Rusty or Mr. Darren. I'm going to look at them and they will handle it, right? If for some reason none of the elders handled it, well, then there would be some kind of failing of the whole group, right? That hasn't happened. But that's their responsibility. That's why they have to be able to teach. They have to be able to communicate a spiritual thought. And that's why this is so important or highlighted in my mind. One last phrase. This man can protect the flock with the sword of the Spirit, right? Our only offensive weapon against wickedness. And if he can wield the sword of the Spirit, he can protect the flock with the sword of the Spirit. 1 Timothy 3:3, not covetous, right? American Standard says not a lover of money. You're familiar with this phrase, not greedy of filthy lucre, right? Not greedy for money in the New King James. This is a man who's not attached to the things of this world. You know, he's laying up his treasures in heaven, and being around him, you know that his primary treasure is in heaven, and that's what he's most concerned about. He's not attached for the things of the world. Obviously, a man who was seriously struggling with greed and was known for his greediness would not be qualified to serve in this position. Patient. New King James has the word gentle, which I like a little bit more. In my mind, and you've heard me say this, a spirit of gentleness can be seen by approachability. That this is the type of man that I feel comfortable with going to. He's approachable. Jesus was gentle. How do we know Jesus was gentle? Because Jesus was approachable. It didn't matter who you were or what you did or how you used to live. You felt comfortable going to Jesus to talk to him about it because he was a gentle man. He was gentle and lowly in heart. And that's how the bishops need to be as well. They need to be approachable men. Men we're not afraid to go talk to, but men who we think could be helpful to the situations that we're in. Going sort of along with that, we have Titus 1:7, the phrase not self-willed. This speaks to the man's humility. All decisions that he makes are not about our way. You know, his primary thought isn't, well, this is how Gardendale does it. That's not his thought. It's definitely not my way. Well, this is how I do it. That's not his primary concern. His primary concern, this is all about his way, Jesus' way. He's not self-willed. Not let my will be done, but your will be done. That's the attitude of this man. And I think that might be one of the hardest ones to get to. I really do. You know, all of these things we work on, we aspire to, we get to the point where others see it in us, and then we become qualified to serve in that position. These are all ones that we work for our whole life. This is one I think we work for our whole life, to learn how to beat down our own will and bring up the will of the Father and of the Son and the Spirit. Not a novice. Old King James. This is spiritual maturity, right? This is someone who's been a Christian long enough that he has some experience being a Christian. This isn't someone who would we ever consider to be a new convert. But as well, you know, he doesn't just say spiritual concerns. He also says, you know, just not a novice, simple, which makes me also believe it's maturity in age, right? Like there's a thought that not only is he spiritually mature, but he's also mature enough that he's been on this planet for a while. He knows how things work. He has some experience in that. You know, what word or what role name would God give to this thought? Not bishop, not pastor. What would it be? It would be the word elder, right? Like, why is it called an elder? It's because the men are supposed to be elders. right? I've said this 3 times, and every time I say it, people act like they're shocked. But there is no middle age in the Bible. No one ever calls themselves middle-aged. We've got people probably 95% of us in this room will refer to ourselves as middle-aged. That's something our culture does. In the Bible, you're young men or young women, or you're old men and you're old women. There is no middle. So I think the thought is that if you're not young, then the Bible would call you old. You could be qualified to be an elder if you weren't young. There's not this middle ground here. And I think that's something to consider when we're considering at least the age of a man. Verse 6, to give the whole thought. Not a novice, lest being puffed up with pride, he fall into the same condemnation as the devil. Experience in the Spirit and also experience in this world would help us not become so puffed up that we fall into the condemnation, the condemning of the devil. And what's going to condemn us with the devil is pride, right? One of the worst enemies that we have as Christians, our pride. I thought what was interesting here, nowhere does the Holy Spirit say, not without pride, or not struggling with pride or something in the qualifications. It's not in there. And the reason why I say that is because a lot of these other qualifications, there's things that you can sort of master. You can master not being quarrelsome. That, I've worked on that for years, and I really haven't been in a fight in decades. That could be something that somebody could actually master. Able to teach, that's something you can master, and you can be able to teach, right? Do we ever really master pride? I don't think it's going to come on this earth. I think pride is something we struggle with and wrestle with our entire lives. And what he's saying here is that these are the tools, not a novice. These are the tools that a man needs to keep on wrestling and fighting with pride. And if he has these tools, he can fight pride, and he can fight pride successfully for the rest of his life. Titus 1:8, just. It is the same in all versions. Just. What I think the thought is here is that this man shows no partiality. He is everyone's elder. He is the entire local flock's elder. He's not saying, well, I just take care of these people. Well, I just care about these people. I just look into these people. No. He shows no partiality. He's just. He's fair, right? The fairness here comes out in the work that he does. Here's our last one. Holy. We don't have the time to explain this word. There's an aspect of holiness that a lot of it is Jesus' work. Jesus makes us holy by sanctifying us. There's another aspect of the word that we practice holiness, right? Thessalonians says, flee sexual immorality, be holy, right? The thought is that we practice the sanctification that's already been brought on us. This is a big word, and it's really something we all should be in this room. We all should be holy by the blood of Christ and by the way that we live to walk worthy of what Christ has done for us. I thought a nice way to sum it up for our setting is just to say this is a man we can imitate because he imitates Christ. That's practical holiness. Paul says that about himself, and I do believe that I know men and women in my life that I could say that about, that I would imitate them because they imitate Christ, right? Holy is a big one, but it's certainly in this setting something that can be attained, something that can be reached for, something that a man could be qualified to be. Thank you for your close attention. You can put away your Bible or get ready to sing the invitation song. Of course, I'm happy to continue this conversation with someone who has a question or a comment about it after, like we do with all of our sermons. As a way of invitation, let me say this. Obviously, there's a lot here that we focus on men who serve in these positions. You can preach this sermon very much to young men who we would like to reach and aspire for those positions maybe one day. But in reality, all of these, except for the family ones, are things that we all should be aspiring to be, right? Because a lot of these things, except for the family ones, right, are things that are seen in Jesus. Able to teach. That's something we all could aspire to be, not necessarily publicly, but certainly privately. Being not quarrelsome, that's something we all should aspire to be. Holy, just. Those are things we all could be putting on, right? Imagine a local church where every member meets those spiritual qualifications of a shepherd. Can you imagine that for just a minute? Would the shepherds have a lot of heavy lifting to do at that local church? Would those shepherds be constantly scratching their head going, oh no, what are we going to do about this one? Imagine a local church that met all those spiritual qualifications. That would be a church that would be a force to reckon with. Could I say that that would be a church that Satan would flee from? If there's any way we can assist you with your spiritual walk with the Lord, why don't you come forward as we stand and as we sing?
Jesus comes to reward his servant.